right, welcome back. We are going to get started taking some measurements now with the Roomy Cube Wizard. I changed this from the dark view to the light view. I think folks have a little bit easier time seeing that sometimes. So that's the only difference in case you're wondering why the window looks a little bit different than what it did before. The first thing that we do when we take measurements is I'm in the habit of double checking my preferences. So if I go to preferences here, we just finished setting these. So I want to make sure that the sample rate, my output device, my input device are all correct. And then lastly, I want to double check that my calibration file is still there for my microphone, which it is. So we are good to go, and we are ready to start taking some measurements. The first thing I want to tell you is make sure the volume is turned way down. Not muted, actually turn the volume down. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to measure our speakers at a fairly loud level, but we want to be at a very specific level. We want to get there a little bit slowly, because these sweeps are going to be loud, but they shouldn't be so loud that they hurt your ears. But the last thing we want to do is damage our hearing or even damage our equipment. If you start throwing a full blown perfect sine wave, at a sub, and you're not ready for it, if the sub has been, beat up on and it's nice and hot, hasn't had a chance to cool down, you can damage equipment running some of these things. So that's another reason we want to make sure that we keep things turned down. So we'll go ahead and walk through that. So the first thing that we want to do is, again, make sure your sub volume's turned down. I'm going to do that myself. Okay, so it's nice and low. And we want to open up two things. We're going to open up the SPL meter. So the SPL meter is exactly what it sounds like. It is a digital version of the old school, and I don't want to say old school, they're still applicable, but digital version of the handheld SPL meters that folks used. The way I always like to have mine configured is I always like to use the C weighting. The C weighting is a little bit more in tune with the way that human hearing is. So there's a little bit of a roll off at the end, a little bit of roll off at the high frequencies as well. The A weighting doesn't really take the low frequencies into account as much, and the Z weighting is flat, so that actually tends to overemphasize the low frequencies. So that's why we want to use the C weighting. We also want to use S, which is slow, because otherwise this thing tends to jump around way too fast and it makes it really difficult to try to get a trim. So we want to use a slow weighting to kind of keep it nice and easy, nice and simple to read. You could also pull up the logger if you wanted to start logging this, and it'll walk through and it'll show you all kinds of all the different measurements that you care about. So we're not going to use the logger at all, so I'll just close that. SPL meter, if it comes up and it did not for some reason start recording, if you hit this little record button, it'll start recording. So the next thing we need to do is we need to set the level that we're going to take our sweeps at, set how loud they're going to be. The easiest thing to do is they need to be loud, but they don't need to be like painfully loud. And a good guideline is to run your sweeps 40 decibels above whatever your noise floor is. So your noise floor is just how quiet your room is with nothing else going on. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute and we're going to see how low this gets. I'm going to guess it's going to be in probably the upper 40s. But I'll stop talking and we'll see what happens here. All right, so that danced around 45 decibels. So if that's my noise floor at 45, I want to add 40 decibels to that, which means that I want to run my sweeps at 85 decibels of volume. So we're going to keep this. One of the slightly annoying things about REW is sometimes it likes to hide windows behind the others. So I'm going to set this out over here where I can see it. So we're going to go figure out how to set our volume. So what we want to do is open up the generator here at the top. This is just what it sounds like. It's a tone generator. What we're going to generate is noise. We're going to use I'm just going to do this on subwoofers right now. So we're going to use sub calibration level noise. We want to set this to -12 dBFS. The reason that we set this to -12 is because that's also the default for running standard sweeps. So that way we know that we're setting our volume at the same level where we're going to be running our sweeps. So what we do now, again, noise, pink random, subcal. The last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure we're going to sweep our subs. So if we come down here to the output, let's select our LFE output, and then we're going to hit, I'm going to leave the mic on. Hopefully it doesn't cause too many problems, but we'll go ahead and start I'm going to start the signal, let it run for a second, and then we'll come back. All right, so you guys can't hear that, but it's actually playing. If I stop talking, you'll see that instead of being around 45 dB, I'm up around 57 when I'm not talking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slowly increase the volume until that SPL meter says 85 decibels. It's kind of bouncing around 85 decibels. Remember, that's that 45 decibel noise floor with 40 decibels of headroom above that. So I'm just going to turn things up. And once we get in the neighborhood, I'll go slower and start trying to fine tune things. Hopefully it doesn't cause my voice mic to start clipping out or anything like that. All right, it looks like I'm close enough. You're never going to get it perfectly at 85, but you just want that number to kind of bounce around that 85 number. And I think that's going to be close enough for me. So once you've got your volume set, you can hit the little triangle and it'll stop the sweep. So now we are actually set up to run our first sweep. So one thing I didn't cover is microphone positioning. I probably should have done that at the beginning. Maybe I'll go back and edit it, but just in case I don't go back and edit this, you want your mic to be positioned so that the microphone tip, the very, the U mic 1 and 2 and the Dayton all have kind of a similar shape. The very narrow end of that, the skinny end, is where the microphone capsules are. And you want you want the microphone pointed perfectly straight up at the ceiling. And then you want the tip to be essentially right where your ear is, or right between your ears in your listening position when you're sitting there. So I've got my mic boom stand set up. I'll take a picture and maybe edit it into the video to show you how I've got mine set up. But it's basically set up so that the tip of the mic is right exactly where my head would be when I'm listening. When you go through AustinJerry's guide for REW, for getting started with Room EQ Wizard, he actually links to a very specific guide for getting very precise and very repeatable microphone positioning. Even a small change in the microphone position can make measurements look different. So having a way to do that repeatedly is really good. When I get really serious about something, I'll pull out the laser level, and I've got some landmarks in my room that I know exactly where they are and exactly where things need to be positioned relative to that. So, but again, make sure your mic is set up in the listening position, and then we can go and take some sweeps. So we'll go ahead and close the generator and close the SPL meter. We're not going to need those anymore. So in the top left-hand corner, there's a button that says measure. So we're going to go ahead and hit measure. And that brings up our measurement window. So there's not a whole lot that we usually have to configure in here, but I'm going to give you some good best practices. One of the things that we want to do is we want to give everything a name. So I'm going to call this one, let's sweep subs first. So I'm going to call this one my subs. You can have it automatically append some stuff to it if you want. I usually just use it as entered. And then we can actually put some notes in here as well. So I'm going to call this my first measurement. And it'll keep that information in there. So get in the habit of naming things. It's very easy to get a ton of measurements and completely lose track of what's what when you're looking at a bunch of them. The next thing that we want to change is we want to change our starting and our ending frequency. We're sweeping subs. We don't need to go up to 20,000 hertz. We don't need to start at 0 hertz. Typically, when I'm sweeping subs, it's my personal preference. I don't really care about frequencies below about 15 hertz myself. So typically, I'll sweep from 15 on. We'll go ahead and go a little bit lower this time. I'm gonna call this 10, and then we're gonna sweep up to 300 hertz. You want to go as high, at least up to 200 hertz. That should get you up above, well above everything for the LFE channel. It's just out of habit. I go to 300 hertz. Again, remember that default was 12, so that should already be correct. Now, Remember, every single measurement needs an acoustic timing reference. So we need to change this up here on the top right. Under timing, we want to say use an acoustic timing reference. That's all we need to change. Make sure that's set. What that should do is if you come down here to the bottom where it says reference output, it should be pointed at that default speaker that we set earlier, that left speaker. So that should all be set. What you're going to hear when you run a sweep is a little chirp come out of that speaker, and then you'll hear the sweep out of whatever speaker you've selected. As far as selecting a speaker, simple. Output should be set to speaker. Should be able to set this to LFE or whatever channel you want. We're gonna do an LFE sweep, and that's it. That's all you have to worry about. So ready to take our first sweep. I'm gonna get quiet. I'm gonna hit start. You'll probably hear the chirp on the mic and then a low frequency subsweep. And there we go. We have successfully taken our first sweep. So we can see over here on the left is the measurement. When you take more measurements, they're going to kind of stack themselves up further and further and further down. I forget how many it'll hold by default, but you can get a bunch of them in there. It used our name, and you can see it's got our notes here at the top. It's also got a little bit of extra information in here, and that tells us, hey, the acoustic reference was taken on the left speaker. We didn't offset it, and then we can see that, hey, that's how much it was actually measured, the offset from the impulse. The next thing that we want to do is we want to set our the way that our graph is displayed here. The default, the first time you run it, is it goes to this SPL and phase. So it shows our frequency here at the top. We have frequency numbers down here at the bottom of the graph. Then we have our volume, how loud it is here on the left. This is a phase down here on the bottom, so we can see what's happening with our phase. We're not going to get into that. So let's switch to this all SPL graph. Cleans things up, makes it a little bit easier. Now let's set some limits. Let's make this graph so it's a little bit easier. There aren't any hard rules about this, but there are some habits I think that people have fallen into. And if you read AustinJerry's guide, he'll walk you through what some of those habits are. But basically what we want is we want to get it to the point where this left chart, this left scale, the SPL scale, is in 5 decibel increments instead of like these 2 decibel or 1 decibel increments that we see here. So if we go to limits, we can change this to whatever we want. I think I ran that sweep at 10 hertz. So let's change this to match our sweep values. So 10 and 300. And then we can change the range that we're viewing here. I don't have anything up over 100 here, so I'm going to change this to 100. And then we'll change this one down here to maybe, I don't know, what's good? 60 looks good. So that's a little bit more of a readable graph. And I know we've got things in single decibel increments over there. I'm going to have to make, it's just because of the resolution I've got, I'm going to have to make this a little bit smaller. So now we can see we've got a nice, easy to read graph in our room of our subs. So that's it. That you've taken your first speaker measurement. So what happens if you want to go and look at I don't know, your left and your center and your right? Well, all you have to do is hit measure, and let's give it a name. Let's call this our left speaker. Remember, we're going to do a full range speaker. So let's change our ending frequency back to 20,000 hertz. It's the top end. Volume is going to stay the same. Once this is set, you don't really mess with it. So just make sure it's set. Acoustic timing reference is already set. All we have to do is change our speaker to our left. You can use the same speaker for the reference output because it does play 2 different sounds. So let's go ahead and sweep the left. Right, so here's our left speaker. This is a bass managed speaker, so it's set to small and it's crossed over at 60 hertz. So that the other thing to think about too is, remember, the LFE channel is 10 decibels hotter than your non-LFE channels. So if I come in here and pick a peak, so that's at 80, notice the next peak is, it's close enough to 90. There's going to be some variability based on the room itself, but that's why there's a 10 decibel offset between subs and your mains if you sweep them at the same level. So let's go through. I'm gonna sweep the center and the right real quick, just so we can get a few more measurements out there. Process is the same. Center, change the name. The frequencies are already set properly. All I have to do is come over here, change it to the center, run my sweep. All right, and then we'll run one more, and we'll go ahead and run the right. Right, run that sweep. All right, and we're done. So we've got a bunch of sweeps. Now, notice we've got sweeps that are first of all, the low end on these all overlap. That's because these are all set to base management turned on. So I've got crossovers, and they're crossed over to my subs. As I mentioned, they're all crossed over at 60 hertz. That's what I use in my I've got some pretty beefy left, center, and right speakers, so I can cross them down a little bit lower. It also helps me get nice natural sounding voices without too much creeping in. But then after that, things get real crazy. Again, we probably want to go in and adjust our limits of what we can see here to make things a little bit more meaningful. So let's go to limits. And instead of going to 300 hertz, let's go all the way out to that 20,000. And it looks like we've got some stuff that's dipping down below that 60. So let's go set this back to, let's go set this back to like 40. There we go. So apply settings. So we've got this graph of all these responses, and you're probably wondering what all this mess is over here. Well, these big dips that we see over here are essentially the impact of room modes and getting cancellations, and those things are less impactful but much more common when the frequencies get higher. What we can do to make this a lot more readable is we can apply smoothing to our graphs. This is one of the things that you'll see people harp on a lot out on the forums, is you want to make sure that you're not hiding anything and that you're using the smoothing that's the most appropriate. So up here in the top right, if you hit controls, there's this top section right here where it says no smoothing and then apply smoothing. There's a lot of different types of smoothing that you can use. The lower the number, the smoother it looks. That hides a lot of the problems that we want to diagnose. So we would never use a one-to-one smoothing. I think most people will see like if you're applying it to everything, you'll see like a 1/6, a 1/12, or maybe a 1/48. But that's all you have to do is just go in and change that, and you can start to see what the response looks like. My personal favorite smoothing to use is actually, it's called VAR smoothing here, but that stands for variable smoothing. And what that does is that applies different levels of smoothing across the entire frequency range. And this is the one that's recommended to use when you're going to be using EQing a curves to figure out what things look like. So essentially you get no smoothing down on the low end. You get a little bit of smoothing in the middle, a little bit more, and then it ends up, I forget where it maxes out. I'd have to go check the documentation on it, but this is the one that I like using the most. I think it's the most readable, but it still provides a good amount of granularity, so you can see where problems really are. So there we go. We have smoothing. Also, when you have smoothing turned on, you'll see the type of smoothing that is used down here at the bottom. So VAR is just variable. If I unselect these things, I can go in and change the smoothing. If you're ever displaying just sub data, so like a sub sweep from 1 to 300 hertz, always use no smoothing. Never smooth sub only data. We can turn this back on, and there you can see everything overlap. So there you go. There's a quick primer on measurements. I don't think I missed anything. I'm double checking my notes to hit all the things that I wanted to. Yep. So we're good to go. I'm going to follow this up with how to take measurements of subs only or just your mains. And we'll go into that here in the next segment. One thing that I want to note is if you are done for today, you're going to pick up the next video later on. Take this opportunity to turn the volume on your receiver or processor back down. Nothing worse than finishing up a session and flipping over to check something out with content and getting your ears completely blasted out. So if you're going to be doing that, take this opportunity to turn your volume down. Otherwise, we will see you on the next video. Before I forget, there's one thing I wanted to note. I mentioned this earlier in this video, or maybe in the intro. I'm not going to go into interpreting all of these graphs, figuring out what's meaningful. how to use all the different graphs that REW provides. I mean, there's impulse graphs to learn about. There are RT60 graphs that talk through, help you figure out if you've got reverberation or echo issues. You've got waterfall graphs for looking at your subwoofer and frequency response in your room. You've got spectrograms that are similar to that type of a view. So I'm not going to go anything into all of these. I highly suggest going through AustinJerry's guide. He walks through almost every one of these charts and graphs to kind of tell you what they mean. I did want to just show them to you really quickly so you know that they're out there. But we're not going to walk through all that as part of this series anyway. So anyway, we'll see you on the next video.